Hello, Lee. Welcome to Disabled and Proud. How are you today?
I'm really well, thank you, Brooke, and a pleasure for having us on.
Without further ado, let's dive into the first question that I ask absolutely everybody on this podcast, and that is, how do you refer to your disability?
So I refer to my disability as I am autistic.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it's something I got a diagnosis of only 2 years ago as an adult.
Wow.
So it's been a journey that was both kind of liberating and frightening.
Yeah, I can
But I
imagine.
also live with a chronic autoimmune condition,
Mm-hmm.
which creates certain challenges, but it's something that I've found really beneficial management of over the years, and it did impact me quite significantly physically
Mm-hmm.
when it first happened 9 years ago now. But through that has actually helped me to become a lot more resilient, a lot more resourceful.
Mm-hmm.
And through that journey, actually kind of got me onto the pathway of making an impact in the world like I do now. And if anything, through those challenges and through that adversity, we quite often find out what we are capable of. And it shapes us to be able to do, great things.
Yeah, definitely. And I've actually, so many questions have like sprung to the forefront of my mind as you were talking about how you refer to your disability, because I think when you aren't necessarily born or diagnosed with your disability from the offset, it means that when that happens, when that diagnosis happens or that life-changing moment happens, it does exactly what it says on the tin. It completely changes your life because you're now adapting to a brand new way of living. And so I think if we start with the autoimmune and then if we move on to autism, because that's how chronologically it's happened for you, I would be really intrigued to know how your life changed when you were diagnosed with your autoimmune disease. What was that like for you? What was that experience like?
So to kind of frame the context, Brooke, I just turned 29
Yeah.
and my son was 18 months old. My wife was 6 months pregnant with our daughter. And I was thinking about, I'm going to be a father of two. I'm going to be 30 next year. What things should I do before I am in my 30s, have two
Yeah.
children, and should be responsible?
Uh-huh.
And, you have those kind of thoughts running through your head about what you could potentially do. And then all of a sudden, over the course of a few days, my immune system effectively failed
Okay.
and started attacking some of the tissues in my own body.
Mm-hmm.
And I went from being, physically active, I went from being very independent, running a tech business, to, in the course of a few days, being in hospital bed, not being able to wash myself, not being
Yeah.
able to feed myself properly, and being completely reliant on others to do the
Mm-hmm.
very basic, life things that I had taken for granted.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
at first, you have the kind of the emotions that you have to process, the frustration, the anger,
Mm-hmm.
the loss,
Yeah.
and trying to, work out what I was going to become, really, because I'd
Mm-hmm.
lost my physicality, I'd lost my independence, and that's not something I'd faced at any point in my life before. So
Yeah.
there was a bit of, why me, why now? I've always looked after myself, my
Yeah.
I was going to step back from the business to spend more time with my children, and all of a sudden everything was taken out of my hands. So it was difficult, but I spent a month in hospital being tested, being, having fluid drained off, being, poked and prodded to try and work out exactly why it happened. And
Mm-hmm.
I think within that period, after I kind of got through those initial emotions, I actually realized that I'd never really been grateful for things, and now I've lost them. It's given me a very kind of holistic viewpoint on all the many things I should be grateful for.
Mm-hmm.
And that played a significant role in getting back on my feet and being able to walk again, because I couldn't
Yeah.
actually stand up and weight bear due to the amount of damage that it had caused. So for me, yeah, that kind of initial moment was all the human things that you feel when
Mm-hmm.
the world seems uncertain. You've lost the very basic things you've taken for granted. But that actually then gave me a platform in my recovery to
Yeah.
really look outside of myself and see what was important, and to be grateful for things that I'd never even thought about before.
I think it's so interesting that you say, you know, it made you reflect and realize that you hadn't really been grateful beforehand. Because I think particularly for people who acquire their disabilities, it's like it's completely life-changing. But you're right, you do take things for granted, like being able to walk, being able just to pop to your local shop without having to think about it. Whereas, you know, when you become and you acquire your disability, your whole life and the way that you have to think completely changes, because it's not just, oh, I'll get up and go to the shop. It's, can I get to the shop? Can I get up to go to the shop? Will I be able to walk around the shop and be okay? Do I need support? What's the accessibility like? Can I get there by myself? And if I can't, is the route accessible? There are so many other factors that you have to take into consideration. And I love that actually acquiring your disability made you more grateful, because I think as a human race, we all need to be a bit more grateful anyway. Like, we lack gratitude. We are all so obsessed with instant gratification that it's going to be the downfall at some point. But to be able to have that moment where you almost sit and reflect is kind of a wonderful thing, even though it's brought about by really unfortunate circumstances. And if you can take that away from anything, isn't that the most magical thing that you can do?
Yeah, and I kind of reflect now, Brooke, in that, you know, that moment, it didn't happen to me, it happened for me.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
being stuck in a hospital bed, not being able to move, and removing and stripping back, you know, some of your kind of acquired masculinity around, you know, it being about physicality and independence and the individualistic aspects that our society presents. All of a sudden, you are completely reliant on your network and those who ultimately care for you. And that is powerful, because it showcases just how, you know, precious that network of people around you is, and how human beings are continually connected. And the reason, I suppose, why I say it happened for me is because it did make me stop and reflect and put me into a situation where I had to be able to really kind of peel back some of those layers of the onion and who I was and the impact that I wanted to make. And I think the biggest thing for me from that was I actually, after those 4 weeks in hospital, came to a place of acceptance. Acceptance that this has happened, acceptance that I'm not 100% sure what the future holds. But that acceptance allowed me to really focus on my recovery and do everything I could to try and get back on my feet and to try and manage my energy. And the biggest thing in that was my daughter was born when I was in walk-in rehab, and I was driven towards being able to take her first steps with her. And that really fueled my recovery, because we'll do more for other people than we'll do for ourselves. And through the setbacks, I always had a really kind of positive outside of myself goal to be not only walking with my daughter, but after that to be running around with my children. And, you know, there's nothing quite more powerful than looking about how things that have a significant impact on you can actually be, you know, the catalyst to think a lot more about others, but also about the impact that you have in the world as well, and the legacy that you create with your little actions day by day.
Yeah, and it's so true, isn't it? Like, I always say it's about the we and not the me, because being able to think about other people, you're right, like you will always do more for other people than you'll do for yourself. That's why people pleasing exists, and that's why you put friendships above yourself sometimes. And I love that actually your motivation was your children, because having that and having something to look forward to and having something to strive to, particularly when it's like, kids just bring like a different energy to everything. It doesn't matter what you're doing, who you are, kids just make everything better. Like, looking for that, you know, being able to walk with your daughter, and I'm like, what pure motivation, you know, like, isn't that beautiful? And that's like a great thing to be able to look towards and aspire to do, and you did it and you smashed it, and now here we are. Like, if these things hadn't have happened, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So, you know, it's crazy how the universe works.
Yeah, there's real power in it, Brooke, and I think that, again, if I kind of reflect back on that experience, we will all navigate challenges, and adversity doesn't discriminate.
Yeah.
But ultimately, that ability to go through things which make us become more empathetic and kind towards ourselves, but also see just how vital our support networks are and how interconnected we are with others. I think in a world where, you know, individualization has been an issue, where people do feel like, you know, they have to be self-made and they have to do it all themselves and they have to prove people wrong. It creates a place where people are not considering the wider ecosystem impacts of their actions and don't actually realize just how easily the things that you consider for you as an individual can be stripped and taken away. And, you know, when you go through an acquired disability, you have to process that identity change. And if you can't express that to people around you and you can't, you know, help, you know, almost kind of sculpt that little change within yourself, that's when people really struggle. And, you know, I kind of reflect back and think that I had that support network to kind of talk to. I'm incredibly grateful to those who were around me. But it now gets me thinking about that in other people and what questions might they have gone through to get to where they are, and for the everyday things that they do, all those thoughts and feelings that you don't have and you're unaware of when you don't, you know, are not impacted by a disability in that way. It actually makes you more empathetic, thoughtful, and thinking about, you know, how you can make things more accessible and inclusive for others.
Yeah, for sure. I'd love it if we would be able to move on to your autism diagnosis, because having these conversations with a lot of adults, and particularly adults who get diagnosed with autism in their adulthood rather than childhood, it makes things make sense. But also, like you said, again, there's a grieving process, because had you known sooner, or had you had this diagnosis sooner, there would have been a lot of things put in place to make the world more accessible for you, and for you also to make sense of your own brain, because the way that we're hardwired is not the same. And that's universal. That's every single person. But particularly when it comes to autism, it's wired in a different way from what is like bog standard neurotypical. And I was wondering what that experience was like, from going to getting your diagnosis to then being diagnosed and to now being an adult who proudly identifies as an autistic adult.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the first thing to really say, Brooke, is for me, I've always known that I navigate the world differently, that I communicate differently, that I would see things differently, and especially when I was younger, challenge and was curious about why that was. And I knew that I struggled with certain things from a sensory and social perspective. So I've always kind of known and felt different, like a bit of a misfit, and always been pushing in some ways to conform, but in other ways to challenge. So I always had that feeling. And really, you know, my process started in my son's diagnosis journey. So
interesting.
So you'll probably hear this from a lot of autistic adults, but it actually starts with your own child. So my son started the process. And me and my wife went to see the educational psychologist. He had his kind of assessments, but then there's parental interviews as well afterwards. And as I was leaving that room, the educational psychologist said to me, "Lee, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree." And as blunt as that, I just kind of thought, well, if we're going through this process with my son, I feel there's a real benefit in me going through the process as well, to be able to kind of be on my son's journey with him too, and kind of really showcase and have something that he identifies as, that he's not on his own in the family. And, you know, I think I kind of felt it was probably in some ways for him, but maybe a little bit of clarity for me as well. And, you know, entering that process, I'm fortunate enough to be in a place where I could accelerate some of that, because I'm in a financially stronger position than a lot of people. And, you know, with the waiting list as they are, that's a real privilege. And it's shocking the system is as, you know, behind and as antiquated as it is. And yeah, I suppose I do and speak quite a lot about that at this moment in time, and a lot more advocacy behind, you know, why the systems and structures are just so broken. in helping people get the support that they need. But for me, like I said, right at the start of the episode, it was like liberating and frightening at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of my strong interests is people.
Yeah.
I've had that since I was a child. That's why I've kind of, gone off in ways of business and psychology along my journey. But what that's kind of meant is that I've become quite skilled at crafting a whole range of masks for different situations. And
Yeah.
there's almost a level of pride in my ability to, quickly switch between them and just kind of select the right ones. I'd almost create playbooks for individual people by kind of watching them and seeing how they responded to things, and then almost kind of making a little bit of a bespoke mask for that person. So I've had to kind of really take a step back and think that I've actually built masking as a skill, but
Yeah.
it's not a skill that's allowing me to be me.
Mm-hmm.
Am I going to still kind of flex who I am? In some ways, yeah. As human beings, we do that. Otherwise, we become very kind of one-dimensional if we're always authentically us. It's a real balance, because there are situations where when being authentically you and in your typical world can be quite unsafe. But for me, it was about, I ended up taking pride in my ability, but actually it's an ability that's stopping me from being me. And I needed to go back, like many autistic people do, and try and work out what are the masks and what's me.
That sounds like a lot of internal work, and as you said, it's liberating and frightening as well, because on the one hand, you've been given this gift that's like, here is your diagnosis, this is why sometimes things may seem really strange to you but normal to other people, and this is why sometimes you can feel like you're out of place when you're absolutely not. It's just how you see the world. But then on the other hand, it's like, I didn't know this information, and therefore I've curated myself in a way that makes me fit into this world that isn't meant for me, but I've done it so well, I now can't necessarily separate who I am and who I've curated apart, which, like, I can only imagine how, like, nerve-wracking and terrifying that is, as I personally like to think I know myself really well. So the thought that I wouldn't know myself very well is quite a scary thought, because I think, all humans like to think we really, really know ourselves. And I think particularly being an adult at this time, it must have been so challenging, because you've gone through your whole life being you. You've never been anybody else. So the masking aspect of this, I think, is such an interesting one, because I think naturally people use masks anyway, but obviously I'm very aware that in the neurodiverse world it's way more prominent, and it's almost a very different thing to how I would say I'd mask. Sometimes I can be really happy for certain people, but that's only because that's human nature. It's not me actively not being able to fully understand the situation, and that's probably not even the right terminology as well. So I've probably offended a whole lot of people, so please, I apologize if I have. But being able to separate yourself from the masks, I think there's something really, again, really beautiful in that, because you're almost rediscovering who you are, and that's also quite a nice position to be in as well.
Yeah, it's like a scary self-awareness journey.
Yeah.
So I already had a level of self-awareness due to the stuff I've been through, and kind of having a little bit of a toolkit, and having been through mental health challenges when I was at university, redundancy very early in my career. I'd had some moments where I'd had to build some self-awareness through that adversity anyway.
Yeah.
And the kind of the aspects around masking, where you are kind of suppressing aspects of yourself. I think that's the biggest thing for me, where some of the kind of the crafted stuff around flexing how I was for other people, without being like people pleasing, but trying to actually be more adaptive to situations rather than completely disowning who you are. It's a really fine balance. And for me, it was more about, what am I suppressing and holding back? And am I standing, in situations where my senses are overloading, but I'm just pretending they're not? And, getting a diagnosis gives you that permission to step out in those situations, to actually, really focus on your own self-care a little bit, because these things are tiring. These things, they compound. All the little things that happen, they build up, they make you tired, and they can be exhausting. And I think that it's that awareness. And for me, I had to kind of go back. We all have emotive memories from our journey, those memories that have strong emotions attached that, we're able to recall very, very quickly, and almost tinker within them and pick them apart a little bit to see, because, a lot of people end up in that position, like, what is me and what is my autistic self? And my autistic self is the same thing, but what would happen different in those situations? I think some people go into them and ruminate more and play with them more, whereas some people just find acceptance, let it be, and kind of start the new chapter of a new page in the book that is their life. And there is no one right way of doing it. Everyone has got to kind of find their way to move through that and come out of the other side with an identity that they feel is them. And it's diagnosis can be the start of some of the most interesting and challenging self-awareness journeys, as you really kind of find the concept of who you want to be in the world. But that diagnosis journey also leads people very often after an initial process. Some people, have that grief and that loss. Some people have it stronger than others. But what I so often see come out the other side is an awareness of the times when you might need a little bit of support, and the feeling you can ask for that, and you don't need permission from society. But also people then being able to go feel more kind of confident and assured in themselves, and, quite often more purposeful and meaningful in what they do as well. And for so many people, that diagnosis becomes the permission to go and bring themselves to the world and do great things, and take the handbrake off for a lot of people. This handbrake that they've had on for years. And especially, I see this so much in neurodivergent women who are diagnosed after, being very, very adept at conforming to society's expectations. But that stopped them from ever accelerating on the things they can do in an amazing way. And I've said it quite often, if, the country and if the world was run by a group of neurodivergent women around that top table, they'd probably solve most of our wicked challenges that we have as a race pretty quickly, because they go to solutions, they think in diverse and, kind of multifaceted ways. Yeah, I think, we'd end up in a very different place as a species, because they just see the world differently, but it creates amazing solutions and real focus on what actually matters, and application and execution in a whole range of ways. But yeah, that's something that I feel is a theory. Maybe we should actually try that out as a species. I'm sure it would really bear fruit.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I like to think that disability can impact your career choices. And I was wondering how your career has changed since acquiring a disability, since acquiring your diagnosis. Because I think, disability is such a big part of our lives when you're disabled that it's quite difficult for it not to impact what you do for work. And I was wondering if you could just explain a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I've got probably 3 strands here. Firstly, there's a lot around disability for employees, and not enough for disability in entrepreneurship. And there's so much focused on employment, getting people into employment. What about entrepreneurship? Disabled individuals can craft things that work for them, bring people in as teams and as support, but actually that allows them to do the things that they do best, and bring the most value, and be able to actually support others and do great things, not always be the ones who need to be supported. Secondly, for me, I went out into the corporate world, and I actually, before I got my diagnosis, I actually just found that I just didn't fit.
Yeah.
And, I spent a few years trying to, and then just abandoned that and built my own thing, where I could shape my business, my days, how I worked around what I was good at, my kind of energy levels, how I worked. And all of a sudden it just felt like, whoa, these are some train tracks that I'm building, but I'm building the journey for me rather than trying to shoehorn myself into a corporate structure that at the end of the day was designed for neurotypical people, like 100 years ago, like, 5-day weeks and certain working hours and systems. And, so it's not been built with people like me in mind. So why would I feel like it is going to work for me? So yeah, I actually, before I was able to say that, I have a disability, I'd actually kind of been chewed up and spat out of the typical corporate world and gone and done my own thing, which has, served me relatively well since. But what I will say is that obviously the business that I have has shifted in that time as well. And I've moved from my original business in the video game industry to now running an inclusive wellbeing agency, where we kind of look at some of the challenges that, people who have disabilities and other minoritized and marginalized groups face when it comes to wellbeing in the workplace, because that's not an area that's, looked at. And through my own lived experience, through the expertise that I have academically, through the business acumen that I've built through being in that world, and through being able to shape things in a way that worked for me, I now have a business that I'm incredibly passionate about. It's built from all the facets of who I am and what I do. And, it's all kind of driven with an ability to make a difference to people who so often haven't had their voices heard, haven't had a space that's theirs, and haven't had things that have been designed for them with them in mind. And being able to wake up knowing that I'm creating that impact every day, there's nothing really more powerful than that. I mean, some mornings I'm a bit stiff getting out of bed in the morning with the challenges that I have, but you know what? I'll tell you what, I wouldn't trade being 100% physically to wake up to go and do a job I'm not passionate about. I'd happily take being stiff and being a bit, struggling a bit, knowing that I'm waking up and I'm going and doing something meaningful, because it gets you out of bed.
Yeah. And I think that's very true. And what you said about disability and entrepreneurship rings a lot of bells, because I had someone on this podcast who said that they believe, and actually I strongly agree with this, that disabled people are the most creative people. And that's because the world is not built for us. Therefore, our lives are spent adapting to this world. And that means that we have to have creative solutions, and we have to think of different ways of getting to places, or even, clothing. We have to think about all these things that not everybody else thinks about. And so we are the most creative people. And quite often we have some of the best ideas, but because of how society works, we're not always allowed to express them, or we don't have the ability, capability, financial resources to be able to. And so I think, isn't that a really wonderful thing that you're able to make an impact in the places where actually it's going to serve people the best, because you're giving people that space, that time, that support to be able to do that.
Yeah, and I've been very vocal about how I feel that, being a disabled entrepreneur, there are significant challenges out there. There's a lack of understanding within systems and structures that support entrepreneurship, funding, business support. Lots of people don't appreciate or are able to kind of understand some of the challenges. And that sometimes creates stereotypes and, a lack of clarity on just what we can do, because people are always focusing on what we can't. And that's so frustrating. But the natural reality of living with a disability, it automatically means that you have to become more adaptable. You have to become more resourceful with what you do have. You become naturally resilient, because you're dealing with higher peaks and lower troughs, and quite often having to manage things such as energy or medication. You have, structures, and you build structures that can offer some of that support. You have to be able to get on. But that's the same as building a business ecosystem. And actually, we are, if facilitation is there, some of the barriers are removed. Disabled entrepreneurs are able to accelerate at incredible speed, really tackle problems in a comprehensive and, multi-channeled way. And actually, we do make some of the best entrepreneurs if we just have the right soil that we can plant ourselves in.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. Someone else actually said something that always rings true to me, and it's that without disability, there is no ingenuity. It doesn't exist, full stop. And it's true, because if we were all the same, there would be no excuse for ingenuity. And because there's disability, there is. And I've always kept that in the back of my mind. So you can have that for free.
Thank you, bro.
That's all right. So I like to ask every guest if they have a piece of advice for a younger version of themselves, so a younger version of Lee, but also a younger person with the same disability as you.
Yeah, so I mean, it's funny because I grew up as a black boy, not knowing that I was autistic, and not knowing that I'd have to manage a chronic autoimmune disease either. So my younger self wasn't aware of some of the things I was going to go through, but also my younger self would have struggled to see any kind of role model.
Yeah.
Because we kind of look at neurodiversity and it's a very monoculture from a research perspective, from how it's modeled in the media perspective, from those that have been vocal and used the platforms. That is starting to change. There's one thing I could kind of tell my younger self, it's that, you have a place, because at times I did feel out of place. That difference, and in a world where difference wasn't celebrated, it was difficult at times to be different. And yeah, it didn't allow me to be myself in times that I wanted to be. But the challenge is that I wanted to know what I would become. And I think the biggest bit of advice I would have given to my younger self is don't worry about what you're going to become. Just let the world come to you.
Yeah.
And just gradually grow, learn, stay curious like a child. And at some point, you'll encounter those things which will help you on the journey. There might be people, there might be events, but go through life working out what you enjoy and what you don't. And at some point, you'll see the underlying threads there. But it can be incredibly challenging. But just remember that for every difficulty that you have, it fosters a strength within you. And that strength is incredibly valuable, because not many people will have that strength that they've fostered. And not everyone will be going through the things that you are. But for every pitfall that you fall in and climb back out of, you get that bit stronger. So there's a lot to be said for the challenges that you have.
Oh, I love that. And I think that's such an important thing to take away, isn't it? That actually, whilst everybody goes through challenges, is that actually they do make you stronger. And I think quite often that can be quite unpopular, because I think sometimes being disabled, it is a freaking challenge. Like I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It can be hard work. And if you're in the midst of that hard work and someone turns to you and says, "Oh, but you'll become stronger afterwards," you're a bit like, not right now. I did not need to hear that right now. But it's only upon reflection that actually that piece of advice is welcomed. And so I think it's always really funny being able to look at your challenges and be like, yes, it did make me stronger, but at the time I thought it was the game over. But actually that's the best place to be.
Yeah, and the truth is that there is a lot of toxic positivity out there. I'm not a big fan of disability being a superpower, because it glamorizes strengths when actually there are significant challenges that pretty much everyone faces across a whole range of different aspects. But I'm not a fan of focusing on just on the challenges either, because there are hidden strengths, and there are certain things that disabled people are incredibly strong at. And we've got to find that balance, being honest and raw about the challenges that we have, but having our strengths validated, accepted, and championed by society. And I suppose if there is one kind of aspect within that, when you're in your most difficult times, having people tell you, "Oh, you'll grow out the other side of this trauma," there's no value in that, because the actual strength is compounded. On those difficult days, you get a tiny bit stronger. You won't see that. because you're in the present moment trying to manage a situation where, you know, your body isn't cooperating. There's something going on that you simply feel like you don't have any control over. To be told you're getting stronger at that point brings absolutely no value. It just almost minimizes how much you're struggling. But it's that kind of self-awareness that you get a little bit stronger.
Yeah.
Just a little bit. It's tiny fractions. But the truth is, disabled individuals have those tiny fractions quite often on the majority of days on a week.
Yeah.
And at some point, that strength comes out the other side. And those strengths are different. They're not always strength in the physical sense. Sometimes a strength in a more mental, emotional, or even spiritual sense as well. So
I really like what you just said about toxic positivity, because I think there's a lot of people in the disabled community, and I feel like I'm educated enough to say this. I've been doing this podcast for long enough to know that there are some people who really milk this idea of toxic positivity, and that every challenge is perfect, and like, we can all do this, and because I can do it, you can do it too. And I genuinely think that's the worst thing in the world, because it erases the actual struggle. And it's that idea that some people love the phrase, and I'm someone who thinks it's the worst thing in the world, is the only disability is a bad mindset. Now, I think that is one of the most disgusting phrases I think I've ever heard in my entire life, for a whole multitude of reasons. But that toxic positivity really plays into that idea. And what you said is so true, is that actually it's not about erasing the challenges, it's about accepting that they're going to exist. But it doesn't mean that because you have these challenges, you can't succeed. And I think that is a much more positive, like, thing to put out into the world than the idea that we're all good and we're all okay and we can all do it too, and so can you. I think, yeah, I love what you said about that.
Yeah, and it's just that thing where, yeah, we know there's aspects around the terminology that people prefer. You should be able to express it how you want to. That's something that's your right as a human being. And if you decide, you know, you use person first language, you make that decision how you want to express to yourself, but don't enforce that on other people. You know, and more than ever, don't suggest that disability because medically it's been decided it's a deficit, but actually it's a difference. And you know what? Use the term how you like, but don't turn it into deciding that disability is a mindset, because you can change your mindset in a minute. There's lots of other things that you can't change in a minute. And yeah, it's when people use stuff like that, it's careless, very careless. And they don't see the greater impact of using phrases like that to invalidate a whole host of people. It's not a good look.
No, it's not. And what I love about it as well is that I know I'm quite good at being able to look at people and summing up whether they're going to make a positive impact or not in the world. You just get a vibe. And it's always the people who think they want to make a massive difference that will say something like that. And I'm like, but the problem with doing that is you have just erased an entire group of people who that doesn't apply to. And you know, the non-disabled love it because they're like, oh, like motivation. And we're like, no, it's inspiration porn, and that's awful.
And it's just like, you know, you even speak to Paralympians, and the way that they're platformed and championed as these superhuman people. But then they tell you, you know, in the athlete's village, you know, someone's damaged this, so they're struggling. You know, so someone who's working on support hasn't turned up, so they can't do basic things. And the one little bit that's televised is them, you know, breaking world records and with medals around the neck, and you know, again, it just creates this idea that, you know, these are the elites, but actually, they have significant challenges as well. And to even get there, very few of them are funded. So it's a very elite group of people anyway who've had the financial backing to be able to actually get to a place where they can compete at a world level. So there's so many different layers to it. But again, we've got to look a lot more holistically, appreciate that actually being inclusive is not just for disabled individuals, but from a wider perspective as well, because many disabled individuals sit within intersectional identities. and not just lacking privilege due to disability, but due to other challenges and other aspects of the demographic as well. So, there is no one disabled person. Like you said back at the start of the call, we're all unique, but we all have something to bring.
Yeah, for sure. I like to ask guests. Now, I think the reason I like asking this question is because as disabled people, as we've touched on, we actually can find it quite difficult to look at the positive attributes within ourselves. And looking back upon your own personal journey, is there a positive trait about yourself or something that you've noticed about yourself that actually, upon reflection, you're incredibly proud of?
That's a really good question. So I think something that is a strength for me is joining dots up, connecting patterns, recognizing things, and that's kind of allowed me to, be able to do some great things over my career, because other people just haven't seen it. It's allowed me to bring disciplines together, to recombine things, to create innovations. It was part of my first business and now forms part of my second business. It's allowed me to go to America and receive a fellowship from the National Academy of Sciences. But actually, that's a really kind of skill-based thing that I'm really strong at. I think for me, it's actually how I've managed to become more empathetic and compassionate as a human being. And that's been forged through the challenges that I've been through. It's been forged by, going against society and being a stay-at-home dad. It's been forged through actually putting myself in situations where I wasn't willing to conform. And that's something that, through my kind of eternal curiosity, so I literally am like a 7-year-old running around the planet, like asking why. I've become more empathetic and compassionate towards others, and ultimately have become a better human being through it. So that's something I'm proud of, like the journey to become a better human. And kindness and compassion are something we need more of. And I'm trying to be a beacon for that wherever I can be.
Yeah. I think that's lovely that kindness and compassion are the things that you're most proud of, because we all like to think that we're compassionate towards other people and we're kind towards other people, but do we have that to ourselves? Quite questionable. But being able to notice that is incredible. Like, I love that. My favorite question to ask people, and I don't know if you might get this, you might not, I don't know, which is why I asked this question. But as disabled people, we quite often get some really bizarre questions from the general population. And I was wondering, have you had any particularly bizarre or weird questions? Or is there one question that rears its head and every time you hear it, you think, oh no, not again?
Knowing lots of people within the community, I know some of the questions they've been asked. And I've had nothing that I would consider on the extreme end of questioning. But naturally, I've had all the things that you get when you've got invisible disabilities. All the stuff around, wow, I didn't know you had to learn to walk again. It doesn't look like you do. You're physically fit, you're in shape. So there's a lot of surprise. Oh, you don't look autistic. And these are things that, because I present in what looks like a typical non-disabled way, I don't have any adaptive clothing. Because I learned to walk again, I've learned to walk in a proficient way, which means that it's very difficult to discern some of the struggles that I have. I look, like from a physical perspective, I don't have any clear aspects of me that appear. So it's usually a surprise. People don't generally know until I disclose. So it's usually a point of disclosure, like shock, and then like occasionally you get the kind of the interesting questions around what how and what does it look like and what does it feel like, and it's not always that easy to describe it. But luckily, and I know some people have ridiculous questions asked. Sometimes out of just sheer curiosity, and sometimes out of a lack of self-awareness around, why you would decide to, and some people just because they're rude. But But no, for me, it's quite often that kind of surprise. And what's it like? And, what does that mean? And obviously, autism is very kind of, again, people's awareness. You're either Rain Man or you're nonverbal.
Yeah.
And the biggest one, Brooke, for me is, so I find it much easier to stand on a stage and talk to 100 people
Mm-hmm.
than I do standing at a networking event talking to someone one-on-one.
Yeah.
Because I have to pick up on all these verbal cues. I have to listen when there's other voices in the room. I have to not be distracted by other people. And I have to try and pick up all this information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Whereas when I'm on the stage, I've got people's faces to pull for feedback. I can focus on my own kind of voice. I'm not having to listen actively to others. But people like, you're autistic, like, and you stand on a stage and talk, and you're really like really good at it. Like, aren't autistic people like sat in quiet rooms, coding on computers? So it's like, for me, it's like breaking that stereotype.
Yeah.
For some autistic individuals, we actually are absolutely fine and have no fear and no kind of, well, not necessarily no fear, but a dampened sense of worrying about things that normal people worry about. Like, I'm not
Yeah.
thinking, oh my God, all these people are looking at me. I'm stood there thinking, all these people are listening.
Yeah.
And actually, it's like, it, some people would say it's like a lack of stranger danger. Not,
Yeah.
yeah, like, I would happily talk to any adult when I was a kid. Like,
Mm-hmm.
don't know you from Adam, you're a stranger, but hey, how are you doing? Yeah, why did you talk to that lady about that? Why did you? So yeah, it was seen as a lack of stranger danger, and now it's seen as a lack of fear of things like public speaking.
Yeah.
Interesting how society frames these things, right?
I think it's very interesting, particularly with in the autistic community. And I feel like I can say this because I've spoken to so many people on this podcast who are autistic. My work outside of this podcast includes autism, is that society has this very, very one picture view of what autism is. And generally it tends to be naughty white boy at the back of the classroom throwing Lego bricks. That's generally what our view of autism, ADHD, ADD has been. That whole neurodiverse community, that is what that has been, because they are the people who get diagnosed first, and because of that, that's what we automatically think of, whereas we now know that that's absolutely not. Particularly men and women present incredibly differently, and it's breaking that stereotype, isn't it? Because that's exactly what it is. But it's a stereotype for a reason. Those boys are not to be disclassified either, because they still need the support. But that's also not what it looks like all the time. This whole idea of, one size fits all, particularly around neurodiversity, but also disability, one size does not fit all. The idea of one size fitting all does not exist. Disability is not a monolith. It's incredibly individual. So it's amazing to have these conversations because, as you said, for you, speaking on a stage is way, way more preferred than to have a conversation one-on-one. Now, if I got somebody else who was on this podcast who was also autistic and you said that to them, that might not be their reality either, but you both are still autistic adults. And it's just that idea that everybody's completely different. Our brains are all completely different. They're all wired completely differently. And taking that on, that autism, again, is not one size fits all.
Yeah, no, it's very much a prism. And, even the terminology spectrum makes people think one end to the other.
Yeah.
Like it's just one sliding scale. And it's you have to look at it three-dimensionally. And, there are small commonalities. But again, one of the biggest challenges is we think about that typical expectation of a neurodivergent individual. It is that, naughty white boy. But the problem is all research has been done on that group.
Yeah.
And until the past 10 years, we've not researched really any other intersectional identity based on that. So the challenge is the very criteria we use to diagnose are built off research that was only really done on one small subsegment of the population. So we're still unraveling all that, because even today, our understanding of what it is changing, because it's not just what we found it to be when it was just, diluted down into one very small individual group of humans.
Yeah.
So I suppose in some ways we are learning, some ways that's exciting, but we're actually having to even unpack the concepts and what it actually is and how we diagnose it to make it more equitable for the future.
Yeah. I think that's a really important thing that you just said, that actually, you know, the reason that we have these stereotypes as well is because this is who we've studied. I only recently learned that women were not allowed in medical trials up until something like the 1970s, 1980s. So that means that all the medical research that we have are all done on men. So we take all this medical knowledge for granted, but that's only because that's how it presents in men. And as we know, the female anatomy is incredibly different to men. So that's why females can have different reactions to men with medications. And this honestly blew my mind. So no wonder we need to break these stereotypes, because they don't make sense anymore. You know, this idea of one size fits all, as I said, just doesn't exist anymore. And we're not in the 1950s anymore. Like,
Yeah.
Times have moved on.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just medical trials, Brooke. It's pretty much everything that exists. Every system, every structure, every institution. But that's a whole of a podcast, right?
Oh, yeah, completely. We'll come back and we'll have that conversation another time. I only have one final question for you, Lee, and that is, are you disabled and proud?
I am disabled and proud. And I walk that, I wear that, and I kind of step through life, you know, proud to articulate it, hoping that it empowers others, whether vocally or within inside themselves, to also be proud of who they are and find a way to express that to the world in a way that works for them, and bring in their abilities, what they can do, and being able to actually be champions of not only themselves, but champions of others as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much for coming on today. I really enjoyed this chat. And yeah, come back soon. Let's have another chat sometime.
Part 2, Brooke, part 2.
Thank you.